So if we haven't met, I'm Joyce the Assistant Minister, standing in the stead of Dr. Edward Filyun, our Senior Minister, who is in Bali just now. And if you were here last week, you heard Dr. Edward kick off this year's theme of One Truth, Many Paths. This year, we're going to be looking at a variety of books of the month, each one exploring a different spiritual practice and philosophy to see how they might enhance our own spiritual understanding and our own spiritual practices, while, of course, staying true to those science of mind principles that we all hold dear in our various ways. This month, our book is Wisdom Walk by Dr. Sage Bennett. And a lot of us do know Reverend Sage. She's a minister in our movement, and she's taught classes at the Holmes Institute. She also has taught world religions at the university level and delved into many traditions herself. And she has a doctorate in philosophy, and just as important as all that, she's a wonderfully kind-hearted woman and a really accomplished writer. So I'm finding it just a delight to be going through her book and learning a lot. Each chapter has an introduction to the spiritual tradition and then presents one practice that is accessible and gives us the option of taking it into our spiritual practice if we like. For example, last week, Dr. Edward talked about Chapter 1, Hinduism, Create a Home Altar. And you may recall that he mentioned that as we are talking about these things in the sanctuary, our kids are also working with these ideas. So he thought you might be interested to see that while we were with him here, our kids were making their own altars. Thanks to Susan Robinson for sharing those with us. This week, our topic is Buddhism. Meditate and find peace. So whereas last week we were looking at creating an external focus point to remind us of the presence of the Divine One, this week we're looking at creating an internal sanctuary, that place where we know we can go to become more aware of the truth that the Divine One is always with us. As we look at Buddhism, it's important to keep in mind that the practice of Buddhism, which began in India and then moved over 2,500 years to various countries, where it went, it took on a different look and feel and emphasis in the teaching according to the culture it met. So, for example, my first exposure to Buddhism was at the San Francisco Zen Center. And there in the meditation hall, I sat with people who were wearing black robes. The dominant colors in that meditation hall were the tans of the mats and the black of the cushions. And the sounds I heard were wood on wood calling us to meditation, a bowl being struck 3 times to begin meditation and once to end, and the chanting we did after meditation. The people who were practicing Buddhism in that meditation hall were sitting completely still, mentally following their breath. Now, think Japanese minimalism, as you can see in this Zen rock garden in Kyoto. Now, in contrast, a couple years ago, Reverend Kim and I and a group of travelers went on a pilgrimage to Bhutan, a Buddhist country in the Himalayas that practices Vajrayana Buddhism similar to the Tibetan Buddhism of the Dalai Lama. And so imagine coming out of that Zen meditation hall and coming here to find spinning prayer wheels and waving colorful prayer flags and monks and nuns dressed in red and yellow and orange robes and walls on the meditation walls of the meditation hall filled with intricate designs of vibrant colors, the sound of horns and gongs. People doing their spiritual practice by walking around the temple chanting Om Mani Padme Hum. So, very different looking, same Buddhism, different looking. What is it that holds these diverse appearances of the practice of Buddhism together is that they're all rooted in the teachings of a man who lived 2,500 years ago in India. Siddhartha Gautama was born the son of a king, and when he was born, there was a prediction that he would either be a great leader or a great holy man. Now, his father, the king, wanted him to be a great leader, and so he arranged things so that Siddhartha would never have to leave the royal court, would never have to leave the palace grounds. In fact, was confined to the palace grounds, but as a young person, he didn't notice because he had everything he wanted, every imaginable pleasure. As he got older, dancing girls, the whole bit. Total luxury, total comfort, total pleasure. Eventually, Siddhartha did what all young people seem to do, and that is disobey their parents. And so he sneaked out of the palace grounds, and for the first time, he came face to face with somebody who was ill, somebody who was suffering, somebody who was dying. You can imagine the shock of that contrast. And it really made him wonder what life was about. It made him wonder what was real, the pleasure that he experienced all through his youth, or this suffering that he's face to face with now. And so he began his own wisdom walk. He started finding Hindu teachers and eventually got into practices that were more and more austere to the point where he almost starved to death. And then realized that neither the extreme pleasure of his youth nor the deprivations he'd been through were leading to truth, that there must be a middle way between these two extremes. So, returning to a moderate diet, he continued wandering until he got the internal nudge that the moment had come. And he sat down under a tree, looking very much like we see him in a lot of our figures, except that he put one hand on the ground and swore on the earth itself that he would not move until he had attained enlightenment. He resisted powerful temptations to move. He went through several layers of awareness, becoming aware of the oneness of everything, becoming aware of his own incarnations, previous births and deaths, becoming aware of the interconnected web of the births and deaths of all beings. And finally, the awareness that underlying this web for everything of birth and death were spiritual principles that guided the way out. They appeared to him as the Four Noble Truths. Before we look at the teachings of the Four Noble Truths, I want to consider this life experience of going back and forth between extremes. Yes, on the one hand, we're talking about someone who lived 2,500 years ago, but I don't know that that's not unfamiliar to us, going back and forth between extremes. I know I have a pretty ready example, and that's living through December. Because if I'm not mindful, this is what my December is like. December 1 through 24, work, 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 work. December 25 through 31st, Relax, relax, veg out, indulge. January 1st, oops, time to eat celery, go to the gym, start meditating twice a day, start reading the book of the month, and journaling, and probably I should take a class at the JC, and while I'm at it, I really do need to make a commitment to see my family and friends more. So I think we're chuckling because we recognize that it's not just Siddhartha Gautama who went from one extreme to another, but we can do it. So ourselves, so how do we find that middle way? What did he learn in his transformation that can assist us? The Four Noble Truths. The first one has various translations. The Sanskrit word dukkha has been translated as suffering or irritation, frustration, pain, anxiety, discontent. Life is discontent. Our experience is that it's never quite exactly right. Even in the very best of times, there's something to complain about as I sit here in my 32-room mansion and that darn plumbing's acting up again. Or I find the perfect sweetie to hang out with, except he or she snorts kind of loudly in restaurants. So that sort of thing, there's always something to complain about. And just a little spoiler alert, I just want to point out that from the point of view of our own spiritual philosophy, we know this. We know from science of mind that any time we're in a state of mind that is separated from the awareness of our divine nature, from our divine source, from our knowing ourselves as divine, we're going to have the experience that life is not quite right. So, Ernest Holmes wasn't born yet, so let's look again at what the Buddha has to tell us. Life is discontent, and by the way, this discontentment or this suffering is caused by attachment or desire or craving, or even you can think of preferences. I want that. I don't want that. I ordered an omelet with spinach, not with kale. I mean, that kind of thing. You know, I want to go see Big Eyes. He wants to go see the Battle of the Five Armies. There's always that kind of thing. As long as we have these preferences, there's going to be discontent. Really good news, noble truth number 3, there can be an end to attachment, to desires, to craving. Imagine in a life where we're not always just heading toward things we want or heading away from things we don't like. Imagine a life where we are content with things as they appear to us moment by moment. The Buddha not only knew this was possible, but he lived it and he taught it. By the way, he became known as the Buddha in that moment when he was awakened, because Buddha means the awakened one, the enlightened one. So he tells us that the way out of this discontent is through the Eightfold Path, and I want to read to you Reverend Sage's very concise description of each of these. Right understanding concerning the nature of reality. Number 2, right thought, which is free of sensuous desire, ill will, and cruelty. Number 3, right speech, which does not contain harshness, falsehood, and meaningless chatter. My particular problem. Number 4, right action, which avoids killing, stealing, using intoxicants, and gambling. Number 5, right livelihood, which means earning one's living ethically, devoid of fraud in the transaction of one's trade. Number 6, right effort, which aims at wholesome states and purifying the mind. Number 7, right mindfulness, or meditative practice, which encourages awareness of self and seeing things as they are. And number 8, right concentration, which strives toward one-pointedness of mind, a state where all faculties of thought are directed toward a particular focus. That'd be nice. So if this is the way out of suffering, great, let's go. Let's start with right understanding. Well, that one might be a little big, so let's take a look at, how about right thought? Also a little subtle there. I know, right action, because we all know about right action, right? We all know what right action is. You know, does anybody else in the house read Dear Abby and Miss Manners and the ethics guy? I mean, apparently we're not all so clear on what right action is. I mean, how many times have we seen something like this? Dear Abby, I just found out that the boyfriend of my best friend is cheating on her. Shall I tell her now, even though she'll be angry with me, or wait till she finds out on her own, at which point she'll be hurt that everyone else, including me, knew? Well, the point is that it's not simple to make the highest choices, to even know what the highest choices are. In fact, the key to it all, I believe, is in number 7, where it says meditative practice. And this is what all of Buddha's students have in common, is that encouragement to have a meditative practice, whether it be sitting still, following the breath, whether it be repeating a chant. Meditative practices help us because they create space between our thoughts so that our real nature can come through. Meditative practices help us become aware of our thinking, help us slow down our thinking, help us observe our thinking. They help us question our thinking. They help us control our thinking rather than being sort of unconsciously tossed about and led about by our thoughts. Imagine a life where the power of the mind is harnessed to do what you want, rather than a state of being in which we're driven by our mind's desires. Until we begin to have a meditative practice, and we might not have the awareness necessary to make the highest choices on the Eightfold Path. We might just be functioning from long-held habitual thought patterns and reactivity. What I see as all Buddhist practices having in common is this knowing that these meditative practices lead to mindfulness, to awareness, to the ability to practice non-attachment so that we can go for the highest choices on that Eightfold Path. Contemporary brain research is confirming this. These words come from Dave Asprey, a contemporary version, I think, of what the Buddha said 2,500 years ago. He says, it turns out that enhancing the prefrontal cortex, which is one thing that meditation does, has a lot to do with willpower, peace of mind, lowering stress, improving health, motivation, and on and on. Meditation, he says, creates awareness, and awareness creates choice. Meditation creates awareness, and awareness creates choice. Meditation and awareness create that state of being in which we actually can experience the freedom to make choices rather than being driven by what we've always done, what we've always thought. So my hope for you is that if you already have a meditation practice, that you are encouraged in carrying on and keeping on. And if you don't, that you'll be encouraged to perhaps look into what one might be for you. There's plenty of books in the bookstore. There's classes offered around our county. There's classes offered here at the center on meditation. There are many opportunities at the center to sit in meditation with others. I love that 4 minutes or so that we take together in our Sunday services to just sit in stillness together. And you can do that at 9:35 on Sundays up in room 6. You can do that on Wednesday at 6:30 in the Gritton Chapel for a half hour. Every week, Saturday morning, a meditation group meets at 10 a.m. in room 10. And then on Monday evenings, there's the Heart Coherence group that meets. Heart coherence is a wonderful technique for calming the body, calming the mind. On the last day of the month, we have our peace meditations. And finally, whenever you see that a vigil is coming up, either like the New Year's vigil that we just had or the spring vigil coming up in April, those are a way to drop into an atmosphere of stillness for as long as you want. Now, the thing I think it's important to remember is that meditation is a practice, which means that we get better at it as we go along. And like any other skill we're practicing, some days are better than others. Reverend Sage tells about how she, was working with her students on this chapter, Buddhism, Meditation and Find Peace. And the kids came in the next week, and a lot of them were grumbling that they had not found peace. In fact, one of them said, I'm glad I'm not the only one who didn't find peace. All I could think about in my meditation was how angry I felt toward the neighbor upstairs for moving furniture around his apartment in the early morning. To which Sage just smiled, and she said, well, perhaps I should have named the chapter Meditate and Find Peace Eventually. For me, I like that story because it's encouragement for me to just accept what's going on day to day in my meditation, whether that experience is peaceful or not, just to keep exercising that meditation muscle. I learned from a Hindu teacher that there are 4 particular traps that we might fall into with our meditation practice. One is that thought that it's not important. Like I'm about to sit down to meditate, and then I think, who cares? Who's this helping? What's this doing? I mean, I can just miss today, I'll do it tomorrow. So that's the first thing. The second trap is that there's something better to do. Yes, I could be reading about meditation, not sitting here doing nothing. How about there's something urgent to do? Like that phone call cannot wait 10 minutes. And finally, a very odd one, I'm different from other people. This can show up in different ways, but usually it's like meditation is not for me. Like I'm just wired differently. Other people can do this. I see them in the meditation hall. They all look blissed out. Of course, we don't know what's going on inside. So that's the final trap. And what I did as a good student of science of mind is I turned them into affirmations and put them on a sticky and put them right by my meditation cushion to remind myself that meditation is important. There really is no better option right now. Nothing else is urgent. And I am the same as everyone else. when it comes to the benefits, to the need, to the ability to meditate. Indeed, we are one. And with that, I invite you into prayer as we recognize together that there is a power and presence, a loving power and presence, which so loves me, which so loves each of us, that we have its full attention all the time. It is always giving, loving, holding, guiding, sustaining, maintaining, providing everything we need. So I welcome for each of us a greater ability in practicing our own individual way of bringing our attention to that divine one, of finding our way to know its presence within and around us, to continue to deepen and widen that connection between our sense of an expression of the Divine One and our sense of that connection with the Divine One. And so for the way our spiritual practice and appreciation and knowing of the divine presence in our life expands, I give thanks now as this word is released. And so it is.